Eric Lipton of the New York Times, thank you very much for being with us on the Washington Journal. And this headline from your newspaper, how Russian cyberpower invaded the United States. And let me get to the essence of what you wrote about. There is no way to be certain of the ultimate impact of the hack, but this much is clear. A low-cost, high-impact weapon that Russia had test-fired on elections from Ukraine to Europe was trained on the United States with devastating effectiveness. For Russia, with an enfeebled economy and a nuclear arsenal it cannot use short of all-out war, cyberpower proved the perfect weapon. Cheap, hard to see coming, hard to trace.
That's right. It really did have an impact on this year's election cycle. We can't say that it had any determinative factors to who won and who lost, but there's no question that it played a role in how the story of this year's election campaign rolled out. It dominated the news because of, look at what happened with the Democratic National Committee convention, the resignation of the chairwoman, the stories that emerged because of John Podesta's emails, the specifics of the speeches that Hillary Clinton had given, even tiny inconsequential things like the risotto recipe of John Podesta that the public got focused on. All of this was because of an act of foreign espionage, and I think we're only starting to now fully appreciate the significance of it.
You and your colleagues at the New York Times really breaking ground in investigating all of this. What has surprised you the most?
I think the most consequential thing that we really got details on is the fact that the FBI had first approached the Democratic National Committee in September 2015. An FBI agent called the switchboard, was transferred to the help desk. The help desk then handed this FBI agent via phone to a low-level IT consultant at the DNC. And the FBI agent told the DNC IT consultant that there was evidence that someone had infiltrated their computer system, and that this player was someone that they associated with a name called the Dukes. And the Dukes is a known Russian cyber actor that infiltrates American government systems for espionage purposes. And that was September of 2015. It was not until April 29th of 2016 that the DNC ultimately confirmed that their computer systems had been compromised. So you have more than 7 months of the presence of these Russian actors on the computer system, and they're taking all of this data, and much of the stuff that was the most damaging came out way past September of 2015. So that is probably the most consequential thing that we learned.
And one of the analogies that you have is the Watergate break-in, the file cabinet that is still on display in the basement of the DNC, and a laptop computer. And the difference over the last 35, 40 years between what happened in the break-in, where that led the campaign of 1972, and what we saw in 2016.
I was doing interviews with my colleagues Scott Shane and David Sanger, and talking to the DNC officials. And one of them mentioned that, well, it's sort of like Watergate. And I said, yeah, I mean, there are some parallels. And they said, we have the Watergate file cabinet in the basement. I said, you have the Watergate file cabinet in the basement? I mean, what an incredible historic relic. It should be in the Museum of American History at the Smithsonian. I mean, I couldn't believe. And I said, I want to go see it. So you go down the elevator to DNC, and as you come out of the elevator, it's sitting right there. I mean, it's not in any kind of a, behind a glass partition or anything. There it is, sitting in the hallway. And the only reason you know is above it there's a little plaque that has the story of Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein on the day that they wrote a story about a break-in at the Watergate. And there it's just a file cabinet sitting there. You look at it and you think it's some old piece of office furniture. And so I was speaking with them about this, and I said, this is sort of incredible that that's sitting there, but I mean, isn't the server that was hacked the modern day equivalent of that file cabinet? And they agreed that it was. I mean, it's a break-in of a totally different kind, but the consequences, I mean, you had a president that resigned after Watergate. I mean, the consequences for the American political system was, one of the greatest moments in the 20th century American politics. But in this case, I think you could argue that the consequences of this break-in, the material that was stolen, I mean, who knows what was stolen in Watergate? I mean, have you ever heard anything about any details of that? The consequences of what they took in this break-in was even, I think, greater in terms of the content. And so that they have, since I first was there, put that server next to the file cabinet. So now the two, targeted materials of the two break-ins of the DNC are sitting next to each other, and it's sort of an incredible historic parallel of different periods, different modes of attack, but a political consequence enormous both.
The issue of Vladimir Putin, Russia, and the hacks really dominating the news conference on Friday, the year-end news conference from the Brady briefing room, and the president said this.
Company, there's not a major organization, there's not a financial institution, there's not a branch of our government where somebody's not going to be fishing for something or trying to penetrate or put in a virus or malware. And this is why for the last 8 years I've been obsessed with how do we continually upgrade our cybersecurity systems. And this particular concern around Russian hacking is part of a broader set of concerns about how do we deal with cyber issues being used in ways that can affect our infrastructure, affect the stability of our financial systems, and affect the integrity of our institutions like our election process.
And the president also saying he told Vladimir Putin to cut it out when he met with him back in September, back in the summer.
Right. One of the big questions which we also addressed in the story was, what was the appropriate response for the United States? There were two critical things that had to occur. One was attribution, which says this was done by Russian actors and it was an act of foreign espionage. And that was important because there was there were other people who were suggesting that this was, including Donald Trump, maybe some guy from New Jersey sitting on his couch. And so the consequences of this hack were sort of, the American public wasn't sure what to make of it. The second thing that needed to occur beyond attribution was retribution, some type of response to say to the Russia or to other parties such as China or Iran or North Korea, who are also quite active cyber programs. This is something you can't do with the United States. You can't interfere in our presidential elections. You can't attack the government through cyber. And in both of those choices, there was a long delay from the White House. The president said on Friday that he first learned about this in the summer. Well, the DNC knew on April 29th that it had been infiltrated and that its systems were infected by Russian actors. Okay, so the president is saying on Friday that he didn't know until the summer, but the DNC and the FBI knew as of April. And then it wasn't until October 7th that the intelligence agencies put out a statement attributing it formally to Russia, although there had been a lot of reporting over the summer that saying it was likely Russians. So, that was a long time during a presidential campaign where there was no formal attribution by the intelligence agencies that this was a Russian actor. And that affected the way that newspaper reporters handled the information because they just were using it for the gossipy content without thinking as much about the fact that they were playing into the hands of a foreign espionage campaign. And in terms of the second question relative to retribution, there has still been no public sign of an action by the United States government to say to the cyber world that this is something we won't stand for, and perhaps they're still debating it. We don't know. Maybe we won't know. But it seems as if the president has said himself, and I'll stop speaking in a moment here, that they were reluctant to act because they didn't want to be perceived as tipping the scale on the election. And if the president was quite concerned about his role in history and also his role in democracy, that if he was too forward and spoke up too strongly, that people would be saying, well, you're trying to help Hillary win the election. But I think also part of the calculus was that they presumed that Hillary was going to win, and so they thought they didn't need to take such a step, and so therefore they were just were more waiting to see how this was going to play out.
Eric Lipton, who is Washington correspondent for the New York Times, his work available online at nytimes.com. Steve from New York City, Republican line, good morning.
Yes, good morning. I wanted to ask you, Obama and the left did no complaining about hacking when it was first disclosed in 2015, and now, of course, you're all hysterical about it. There's Russian hacking. Of course, Putin is behind it now, but specifically the hacking of the DESPA, the DNC, and Hillary's campaign. What evidence is there that hacked them? And should the hacked information not have been used? You remember the Pentagon Papers, which was the equivalent of hacking. The New York Times must have been against that, surely.
Sure. There's two questions there, and they're both important and good questions. I think that the United States has been concerned about the threat from hacking for quite a number of years, and President Obama said himself that on Friday. And they're both the most, serious concern is about the potential for infrastructure attacks on, say, the electricity system or water systems or other, major, the other major assets. But going back to Obama and McCain, there was hacking in the presidential election of Obama and McCain. So hacking has been a threat to presidential and political figures for some time. And there had been a warning that perhaps the presidential candidates in this cycle were also going to be targeted that came out from the intelligence community in 2015. So they had a good warning that this was something that could occur. The thing that really changed in this cycle, which is historic, is that, both the United States and Russia have been spying on each other in their elections for decades. Okay, the United States is certainly watching Russian elections to try to collect intelligence, to try to be, have an idea of where things are going to head and whoever is going to take over, what decisions they're likely going to make. But what happened in this case is they took that espionage and they put it into the public domain to try to impact the process. And that's sort of a radical step that really distinguishes this cycle from the history of intelligence services. The second question you ask is, why did we use this information, and should we have used the information? And there's been a debate that's gone on in the New York Times this week internally about, were we kind of, weaponizers of a Russian espionage plot by taking this information and writing about it, or did we have an obligation because of the public, interest in the material to write stories soberly, to not get too much into the gossip? And the New York Times' position is if there is a news value in the material that the public has an obligation and a right to know, then we should write about it, sort of regardless of the source. I mean, as long as it doesn't bring some, fatal consequences to parties. I mean, we need to not take actions that would really hurt somebody, but that we still have to write the stories. You mentioned the Pentagon Papers. Obviously, the United States government didn't want the New York Times to publish those during the Vietnam War. The New York Times went to the Supreme Court for the right to do that, and we did so. And in this case, the New York Times has taken the position that news material of news value, that even if it's given to us as a result of a Russian espionage, that we have an obligation to write about it, and presumably we will continue to do so.
Eric Lipton's work, the recipient of 2 Pulitzer Prizes. Previously, he was with the Washington Post and the Hartford Courant, now Washington reporter for the New York Times. And Cliff is joining us from Sykesville, Maryland. Good morning, Democrats Line.
Good morning. Real quick, I haven't owned a TV in 40 years, so I've never seen you on TV, but I listen to you all the time on the app. So anyway, I really appreciate your program.
Thank you.
And I have a question. I'm sorry, but I tend to, maybe I'm wrong. Let me ask you, is there any evidence whatsoever that the Russians hacked any voting machines? No, I'd like you to answer that, and then I'd like to pick up. Is there anything at all that they got into any voting machines whatsoever? Any evidence for that?
The answer so far is, from everything that I've read and been told, is that not into voting machines at all. They did get into some voting registration databases. I think in 2 or 3 states they were doing some scanning. There's also a federal election agency, which apparently the FBI is now investigating the possibility that there was some hacking done there. But the voting machines themselves are not connected to the internet. So they are set up, they're designed to have a defense against the possibility of someone using the internet to hack into them. And there is no evidence at all that I've seen that suggests that the voting machines themselves were compromised.
And Cliff, you want to follow up?
Reading the New York Times now for the past week, and my goodness, article after article, front page, Russians hacked the election. What did they? I didn't see you guys so upset, and I'm speaking as a Democrat. I didn't see you guys so upset. Who leaked Donald Trump's tax returns to you? Was that a hack? You had no problem with that. I mean, sorry, but I tend to think that if this were, and how many people were all that upset? The election rigged. The Democrats didn't rig it against Bernie Sanders. I didn't see you guys getting all hyperbolic and bent out of shape over that. You might not even see it, but this is an attack. You don't like Trump. I'm not thrilled with Trump. I mean, one thing, pretend to have a little objectivity in this.
Thank you, Cliff.
Yeah, I mean, I don't mind the question, and I think that, to me, the thing that is most historic and worthy of real contemplation and reflection is that, I mean, if, the evidence is pretty overwhelming that there were Russian actors involved in this. And we were essentially the target of a propaganda campaign to try to influence the presidential and congressional elections of the United States. And again, I'm not going to say that it determined the outcome of the presidential election, But it happened. And I mean, what more consequential thing is there in the United States other than the democratic process of electing the president and Congress? And to think that a foreign actor, conducted a propaganda campaign to try to disrupt that process successfully, and that the news media then became essentially a participant in that by taking the material and then rebroadcasting it and reprinting it, hundreds and thousands of times, and that we didn't focus enough perhaps on that during the election itself. I mean, that's something of huge consequence in American history, and I think that the fact that we're now coming to terms with it more is the right thing, and to some extent we were so focused on the election itself, it was so all-consuming that we didn't have enough of an opportunity to step back and think about it, and I think we're doing that right now.
And from your story this past week, you write the following. As the year draws to a close, it now seems possible that there will be multiple investigations to the Russian hacking. They will wrestle with, among other things, Mr. Putin's motive. Did he seek to mar the brand of American democracy, to forestall anti-Russian activism for both Russians and their neighbors, or to weaken the next American president, since presumably Mr. Putin had no reason to doubt the American forecast that Mrs. Clinton would win easily? Or was it, as the CIA concluded last month, a deliberate attempt to elect Mr. Trump? In fact, the Russian hack and dox scheme accomplished all three goals.
Yeah, again, I think there's an open question there. I mean, there's been some disagreement. The Washington Post in particular has been reporting on this, apparently between the FBI and the CIA, about, whether or not this wasn't specifically intended to try to elect Trump and defeat Clinton. I don't know, actually, to me, that matters that much. I mean, to me, what matters is that this was an effort to disrupt the process of election. It was an effort to show that the United States system of democracy is something that we shouldn't be so proud of. I mean, if you believe that this was a Russian, targeted attack, Russia wants to show its neighbors in Georgia, Ukraine, and its part of the world that the United States is not this noble, democratic institution that it puts itself up to be, and that it wants to undermine the way that others look at the United States, and also look generally at Western democracies. That's why it's doing the same thing in Germany now, and is because it wants to say that, why are you so critical of our own system when these countries and their democratic systems are flawed too? So again, I think to that extent they were successful, because the commotion and questioning of the integrity of the democratic process that occurred as a result of the emails, where, for example, when you saw the sniping, the suggestion that perhaps the Democrats were trying to undermine Bernie Sanders' campaign inside the DNC. That's the reason that Debbie Wasserman Schultz resigned. I mean, whether or not those emails really showed some type of a serious plot, it suggested that the democratic process had been compromised in a way that undermined the integrity of the democratic process in the United States. And the fact that a Russian government players orchestrated that is troubling and historic.
Jimmy is next. Yorktown in New York. Good morning. Independent Line.
Yes, good morning. I think that this is just one little thing, but as to how our system has been taken over, but this is just one part of it. But, you got Saudi Arabia, Israel, that can put all kind of money into our politics, the way the system is set up, to determine our elections, not just for the presidency, but for a lot of other things. And the way the system is set up with the electoral college, it's completely false. And if the Democrats, they get in power, but they don't know how to stay in power. Now, when they had control, when Obama first came in, they had control, they could have gotten rid of this electoral college and made it simple, one person, one vote. And
Jimmy, thanks for the call. That's off topic, but I'll ask you to respond because tomorrow is the Electoral College vote.
Yeah, I mean, Congress couldn't have changed the Electoral College set up by themselves. And in terms of foreign governments influencing the election through money, I mean, it's illegal for a foreign actor to make a contribution to a federal candidate in the United States. Perhaps they can do so through nonprofit groups that they then put money in the super PACs. But for the most part, I don't think I agree with either of those assertions, unfortunately.
Let's go to Dave in Northport, New York. Good morning.
Hey, good morning. Quick, I just want to listen. I'm a very left-wing Democrat, very left, definitely left of center. And I'm going to say, I'm kind of, with this hack on the emails and the exposure of John Podesta and what those emails said, and the corporate lobbyists that was going on. I mean, I don't feel bad that this information came out. I feel good to show that, like, Hillary Clinton, to me, really is like a wolf in sheep's clothing. To me, is not really a true left-wing candidate, and I think she was exposed. I think it's unfortunate that our own supposed news sources couldn't do that. We had to have someone else.
Well, Dave, take it two ways. First of all, you like the information. Do you like the fact that Russia might have been behind this?
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that it's unfortunate, the opposite. I can't believe that our own media can't bring this up. Why does it, it has to be leaked by someone? And you're saying it's the Russian news. And then Hillary Clinton comes up with this fake news, campaign. And I really, I think it's unfortunate that our own media couldn't expose this themselves.
Dave, thank you.
I mean, we wrote countless stories about the Clinton Foundation and about associations between the Clinton Foundation and corporate donors that had interest before the United States government. We wrote about speeches that she gave to Wall Street, but it's true that we did not have the text of the speeches that she gave until they came out in John Podesta's emails. And I wish that we had the copies of those speeches. The New York Times wrote editorials asserting that Hillary should release those speeches because there's no reason that they should have been secret. I mean, newspapers do not have subpoena power. I mean, it's probably a good thing that we don't have subpoena power. We cannot force politicians to release information. We can use our investigative powers to try to collect information from sources, and that's why there's debate over whether or not we should have used this information. In that case, there was a conclusion that this material had news value and we should write those stories. But I think the question in this case is not, did the stuff that come out help bring greater truth to the Hillary's campaign and to what the DNC was doing? Yes, it did. It certainly did, and we would have preferred to have had that information. But do you want to be sort of telling these stories at the same time as you're helping someone else's agenda, and also not getting material from the Republican side of equal value and of equal damage? And that was the thing. We were only writing the damaging stuff about one side as the presidential election was playing out, and that was consequential.
And in the article this last Thursday, you wrote the following: the United States had 2 decades, I should say, of warning that Russia's intelligence agencies were trying to break into America's most sensitive computer networks, but the Russians have always managed to stay a step ahead. But for years, the Russians stayed largely out of the headlines, thanks to the Chinese, who took bigger risks and often got caught. Let's go to Gregory joining us from Pennsylvania. Good morning, Republican Line.
Good morning, gentlemen. My question relates to the obvious spying and unmitigated intrusions of everybody everywhere. And the gentleman used the word can't. Well, unless I'm mistaken, there's a book of rules having to do with attrition. And that more or less is the Clinton problem. They lost. And now what we're trying to do is attribute her loss to something like the Russians, which is attribution. And the gentleman used the word attribution. Now, domestically here and civilly and criminally, such action is criminal. And instead of using the word extortion for the criminal act, we're using the word hack.
Thank you, Greg.
It's true. This was a criminal act. The FBI is investigating it, and the likelihood of them really being able to hold anyone accountable is very small, because if these were foreign actors who are not going to come into the United States, they could issue an arrest warrant, but they won't be able to actually arrest someone. They could perhaps put them on a sanctions list, individuals, and therefore they couldn't enter the United States and get a visa to come here. But there is an investigation, and this, if it was a domestic player that did this, there would be an investigation. If they identified the person would be charged. And the Justice Department is conducting such an investigation. And I'm not saying that I think that this determined the outcome of the election. There was a lot of things that the Clinton campaign did that brought about their own defeat. I think this was a factor, and there were many factors. And when I say that the Obama administration needed to do attribution, it needed to point a finger as to who was responsible for the hack. It's not to blame who won and lost the election because of the hack. It's just to say this party was responsible for it, and that was something that they needed to do.
And with our remaining minute left, let me ask you about the investigation moving forward. Senator McCain on CNN this morning saying that he's calling for a select committee. He is leading the investigation in the Senate along with Lindsey Graham to try to find out exactly what happened. What's it all going to look like?
I'm, you know, as a reporter, I'm not supposed to have too many opinions, but I mean, I think it really needs to be an independent committee, not a congressional committee. It needs to be, you know, some type of a select committee or a commission that's appointed that has subpoena power, that has an independent staff that will investigate this. Because it can't be a partisan investigation. The Republicans could be next. There needs to be a thorough understanding of what happened and what can be done to prevent it from happening again.
Eric Lipton of the New York Times, thank you very much for being with us on this Sunday. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Please come back again. Tomorrow morning, it is a kickoff to the Electoral College coverage that will get underway in state capitals around the country, and our roundtable to explain the process and also the role of the Electoral College